Hello everyone. Leading into Update 35, ZeniMax Online Studios has released a preview to the combat changes. The too long didn't read is that light attack weaving is having its effectiveness lowered, while certain abilities, especially damage over time effects, are having their overall effectiveness increased. Let's talk about it. So, I have a message here from Gilliam the Rogue, as he's known within the community, Alec Varish, as he's known on the ESO combat team. He is breaking down the upcoming changes. There's really two sections to the adjustments he's making. First of all, he is nerfing light attack weaving. There's really no other way to put it. Light attack weaving is becoming significantly less effective in ESO. It's still needed to reach the ceiling of endgame, but the difference between someone who can light attack weave and someone who cannot light attack weave, that gap is being made smaller. The means by which they're doing this is they are taking the scaling off of light attacks. So if you wear a set that gives you weapon and spell damage, you will light attack the same as if you wear a set that gives you armor or recovery stats. While I agree with the intention here, I think that light and heavy attacks are a good area to target as far as bringing the damage in the game down. The methodology doesn't necessarily click with me. The thing is, adjustments to light attack weaving are always going to be contentious, as the ability to weave is fundamental to playing the game properly. As long as weaving exists in the game, there's always going to be that gap between those who can and those who cannot utilize it. The intention with the combat update is to narrow the gap between these two types of players. Adjusting the scaling isn't really the area that I think I would go for with this. It's kind of unintuitive for a newer player and a little bit disheartening for an established player to think next patch my light attacks, which I as a DPS would be speccing 2, 3, maybe even 4 sets in order to improve the damage of, those light and heavy attacks will do the same damage as the tank, who has no set spec towards increasing their damage, only sets spec towards increasing their survivability. To me, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Why is the tank doing the same amount of damage with what's the only shared aggressive ability between all classes and all weapon sets? Light and heavy attacks are universal. Why is such a universal ability not adjusted when someone changes their entire build to do more damage? Seems unintuitive, but the intention, I believe, is correct. Damage is pretty high in the game right now, and it does need a way to be brought down. And going after light attacks, reducing their damage in some way, shape, or form seems like a way to do it. I don't really like that this change comes so soon after they recently adjusted the scaling on how light attacks deal damage. In Somerset, they made light attack damage super, super powerful, and the narrative back then was also, we're trying to narrow the gap, so it's a bit of mixed messages. It's a little disheartening, especially when you consider just yesterday, someone might have sat down and spent 5 hours learning how to light attack weave to get better at the game, and now today they find out all that hard work is meaningless, or at least diminished. Maybe not meaningless, but at least diminished. But you also need to think about, this is a game that has abilities that call meteors down from space, and yet in some ways, when you look at damage logs and damage metrics, that meteor coming down from space actually makes less of an impact than whether or not you're properly light and heavy attack weaving. And I think that as well is a bit unintuitive. That doesn't make sense to newer players. Why would something so subtle, if you're using a bow, your light attacks are almost invisible. Why would something so subtle have such a big impact on your overall damage? we'll wait on this one. I'm hoping that they don't make it just a flat amount. I'm hoping that throughout the PTS cycles they get some feedback. And in general, most of the opinions that I hear is that reducing light and heavy attack damage is an okay avenue to take, but removing the scaling completely, especially after having just adjusted the scaling and buffing the scaling and doing all of these things that essentially told the community, hey, learn how to light attack weave, it's important. And now they come back with, actually, it's not that important. And if you took the time to really sit down and learn how to do it, well, we don't take that time that you've invested as seriously anymore. It's a weird message to send. I don't really like it. I agree with the intention, but the methodology, it's not quite there for me. What I think is a bigger area for conversation is the combat effects. The Too Long didn't read of this, and I encourage you, go read through this. I'm just giving you what I believe my personal experiences with ESO. I probably have over 10,000 hours into this game. I've been playing a very long time, and I've seen a lot of changes come and go, and these are just my impressions of what these changes will do to the combat and what kind of impacts they could have, and as well as I hope that I bring to light some areas that maybe you didn't think of. The adjustments to combat abilities, like I said, it's less cut and dry, and there's a lot more to talk about. In general, I expect this adjustment to have a couple of the following results. Class identities, such as burst versus consistent damage, let's talk Nightblades and Sorcs versus Necromancers or Dragonites. These are your typical Nightblades, Sorcs, burst damage, Dragonites, Necros, more dot-based, consistent damage. Those class identities are going to get more pronounced, so the differences between the classes gets bigger, and I think that's a good thing. On top of that, rotations are probably going to be a wash in terms of complexity. So the motivation for them making these adjustments is to make it so that newer players can spend more time engaging with the combat and less time staring at ability bars. So if you increase the duration of damage over time effects or other buffs, new players can use those abilities less frequently and spend more time watching the actual fights play out. I don't actually believe that this is going to end up how they intend it to end up, because by buffing dots, it doesn't... When you buff dots, you take builds that were using less dots, and now you require them to use more dots. And adding more dots makes the rotation more complex, while increasing the duration of the dots tends to make the rotation easier. So builds and rotations will adapt to the stronger dots, adding more dots, making the rotation more complex, and the increased duration will take away some of that complexity. But you end up in the same place in terms of how difficult the rotation is to pull off. So rotations are potentially going to be a wash in terms of complexity. Overall damage could go up or it could go down depending on how the dots are adjusted. Currently, their proposed adjustments, let's see if I can find them. So they're saying right now on live, a damage over time effect deals 1.5 times the damage of a spammable over its duration of 10 seconds. What they're proposing is that damage over time effects deal 2 times the damage of a spammable over a duration of 20 seconds. And what this means, too long, didn't read. The math on this, old dots needed to tick for 10 seconds to get off all of their damage. New dots will need to tick for 20 seconds in order to get off all of their damage. But they will deal 33% more. When you go from 1.5 times the damage of a spammable to 2 times the damage of a spammable attack, that's a 33% increase in the overall damage of the dot. And if you run the same number of dots, it's actually a wash. So if you're running 4 dots before the change and you're running 4 dots after the change, the damage is actually the same, because the damage that you gain from the increased effectiveness of the dot is completely offset by the lower frequency of casting the dot. If you need more information on this, I have a written explanation on my website, Ender South Online. I would direct you to there if you want to know more about the math behind it or how rotations are impacted. My prediction is that as a result of this change, the number of dots that every build runs will actually increase, which means that overall damage will go up. And knowing that damage overall potentially goes up reinforces my perspective that light and heavy attack damage needs to come down to offset that. So this just kind of reiterates my point with the light attack change. I think that the motivation to reduce the damage dealt by light and heavy attacks is well intentioned and good. Just again, I disagree with the methodology. What else is there? Sustain is an area that could be improved. So if we go from casting, let's say, 4 dots every 10 seconds to now casting 4 dots every 20 seconds, in general, damage over time abilities cost more resources to cast than a spammable. And so the scenario where you're casting 4 every 20 seconds actually reduces the strain on your resources and improves your sustain. If we start adding more dots to our rotations as a result of this, though, it ends up, again, as a wash. Similar to how rotation complexity will be a wash should we add more spambles to our rotation as a result of the change. Lastly, there's huge risks of exploitation for longer dots, especially ground-based AoEs. Established players for the longest time have known about a mechanic they call pre-buffing, which is where either you use a buff or you use a ground-based AoE in such a way that before the fight starts, you can set up the fight in such a way that when you pull the boss, all of your damage over times are already ticking, all of your buffs are already on everyone in the group, and you start the fight off with a huge burst. Increasing the duration of ground-based AoEs has the potential to drive this strategy to the moon in terms of pre-buffing and setting down damage. I think about gear swapping on PC. You could have a scenario where someone runs a back bar that has 5 ground-based AoEs in it. And you could even gear swap. So you could run a Inferno Staff back bar and lay down your Wall of Elements, gear swap to having a bow equipped, throw down Endless Hail, gear swap to a completely different weapon, and then start the fight. And at the beginning of the fight, you would have this long duration of Wall of Elements, long duration of Endless Hail, as well as any other ground-based AoEs that the boss is going to either move onto or spawn onto, and all of that damage is basically free. And this could be really bad. It could drive certain fights like Zahasha, the first boss of Maw of Lorcaj. People might just throw all these ground-based AoEs down, gear swap to a build that has Oaken Soul, and then just sit on their front bar and spammable until he dies. That is a very real possibility at endgame. So there's huge opportunities for exploitation. This is potentially a wash in terms of complexity. I'm very curious what they're going to do. I would like to see more explanation in regards to why they're making these changes, because it's only been a day and I've already thought of ways that this doesn't improve the complexity of the rotation. This doesn't help narrow the gap at all, because new players don't understand pre-buffing. They don't do pre-buffing, and so the players that are going to take advantage of pre-buffing are endgame players, and this, to me, screams that it's going to improve this pre-buff strategy. Now, let's go a little bit more in depth. So, when I talk about class identities, I talk about burst versus damage over time. For Nightblades, Templars, Sorcs, these are classes that have, for Nightblades, they have bow procs. For Sorcs, they have, crystal fragments, crystal weapon. Templars have jabs. These are really strong spammables that can be used right away. They don't have to set anything up. Wardens, they can precast Shulks, but Necromancers can't precast Blastbones. Dragonites, their spammable whip is just it's a little bit behind these other spammables, and they don't have any way to really ramp up whip to crazy numbers like Sorcs can do with crystal fragments, or Nightblades can do with bow procs, as well as their execute impale. That's a huge burst that just needs minimal setup. And so in fights that are short, 10-second fights, it's more valuable to cast these spammables than it is to cast the damage over times. The idea is that if the dot deals 2 times the damage over its duration, and its duration is 20 seconds, if the fight only lasts 10 seconds, then the damage dealt by that damage over time is the same as the damage that would be dealt by the spammable. And a lot of spammables come with additional buffs, debuffs, things that make them potentially more valuable than a damage over time effect. A certain damage over time effect that might be used in that situation is Wall of Elements, especially if you're using the VMA staff, because then you're buffing all of your light attacks as you're attacking the target, essentially getting free damage. But yeah, I actually like this a lot. I think that reinforcing class identity tends to be a good thing. Otherwise, you end up with trials where, or dungeons, or really metas where everyone is running the exact same thing. We're on the High Isle patch right now, and everybody wants Stam Crows. You'll see trials groups that run with 8 Stam Crow DDs, and then support that are set up to give them the unique buffs that they need from the other classes. I don't really like metas like that. I think that they're lame. A change like this could reinforce some of the areas of the game that let other classes get into groups other than just the quote-unquote best class. So I think that in regard to class identity, this is good. Making that burst damage emphasized over the consistent damage over time effects, good stuff. Let's talk about rotations a bit more in depth. So let's say on live you're using a bar setup where you have Inner Light or Camo Hunter, maybe the wings from a Warden to get Minor Berserk at all times. You're running maybe Bound Aegis on a Sorc to get a bunch of Max Magicka. Maybe you're slotting like an extra assassination ability on a Nightblade. Essentially, you're slotting skills on your bar that you don't actually intend to use. You're just putting them there to buff your damage in some way. Let's say you're running a couple of those, and so your rotation ends up with something like 4 10-second dots and a spammable. So you use 4 10-second dots, 6 spammables, repeat. That keeps uptime perfect on all of your dots, and you're just spammabling whenever your dots are down. So your ratio is 4 to 6, 4 dots to 6 spammables, okay? That simplifies to 2 to 3, okay? So basically every 2 dots you use 3 spammables. Now, after the patch, if they buff dots, it's likely that players will drop these passive buffs, such as Inner Light, Camo Hunter, Bound Aegis, and they will put dots in their place. Stuff like Degen, Soul Trap. Maybe a class will start running Caltrops. And in this scenario, let's say that you run 8 dots now instead of the 4 dots that you were running previously. So this new rotation, which is no longer based around 10 seconds because the dots have been extended to 20 seconds, the new rotation is 8 20-second dots and 12 spammables. Okay, so that's 20 global cooldowns, 20 seconds. As a result, you end up with the same ratio. 8 dots to 12 spammables. That simplifies down to 2 dots for every 3 spammable. The rotation didn't actually get any less complex. You didn't get any more spammables versus dots than what you had before. Some of the rotations are going to end up being a wash. Another area where I see potential benefit here is that Sorcs could potentially drop their pets. One of the biggest benefits of running Sorc pets is that they're technically infinite damage, right? You summon the pet, you start the fight, the pet will continuously deal damage until the fight is over, and you don't even have to activate the pet. This means that their damage per cast is technically infinite. It's incredibly strong to have an ability on your bar that deals infinite damage per cast. Now, depending on fight length, some of these dots might outshine the pets. And then we can move a little bit away from this Sorc pet meta, which it's been fun while it lasted, but some things can get kind of stale. And usually I like running Sorcs without pets because they have more abilities that they're using. It's more engaging with the content. And so, yeah, I think that that's potentially a good thing that might come out of this. I am a little bit concerned, though, because it seemed like Zoss's main desire was to make rotation simpler, and this change doesn't make rotation simpler. If anything, it means that now you have to run, like, every single one of your skills has to be a dot. Like, if a dot deals 2 times the damage of your spammable, that's justification for you to run a dot in every single spot on your bar except for the one spot where you keep your spammable. Having to keep track of 9 dots in a trial is not something that I think new players should be faced with. I understand the intention. I really, really question whether or not this will have the intended result. Let's talk a little bit more about the impact on overall damage. So, if dots deal more damage than spammables, you want to cast the dots as frequently as is possible, which for a 10-second dot is every 10 seconds. If you cast it sooner than that, you're losing damage off the previous cast because you're overcasting. With a 20-second dot, you want to cast them every 20 seconds, okay? Now, if a dot deals more damage than a spammable, then technically you want to cast it as frequently as possible. So let's consider a scenario where recasting a dot didn't clear it off of the ground, okay? So if you casted Endless Hail, and then you casted Endless Hail, and then you casted Endless Hail, instead of recreating the same patch of ground where Endless Hail is falling, instead you created a new Endless Hail on that location. Every single rotation would be your best dot, your best damage over time ability, spammed over and over and over again, okay? Because that would simply do the most damage. So, when you increase the duration of these dots, you decrease the frequency at which they're cast. And these are your most damaging abilities. So you're casting your most damaging abilities less frequently, which would have a lower overall damage if they didn't buff the total effective damage, okay? You can think of it this way. If you're driving your car for an hour at 40 miles per hour, you will go further than someone who drives their car 60 miles per hour for 5 minutes. But if you drive at the same speed for the same amount of time, whoever's driving 60 miles per hour will go further. The same concept kind of works with damage. If you're dealing 60 damage per second and you deal that damage for an hour, you're going to deal way more damage than someone dealing 40 damage per second over an hour. With their changes right now, it's actually a wash in damage. So if you increase the damage of a spammable by 33%, but you decrease the rate at which it's being cast by 50%. You cast your dots 50% more frequently. If you keep the same amount of dots, the damage actually is a wash. I know that may not make sense to say out loud, but the math works out. And again, if you want to see the math, my website has it, Ender South Online. So, This is the case only when you keep the same amount of dots. So if you had 4 dots before the patch, and then you have 4 dots after the patch, your damage stays the same. But if you adapt your build to say dots now deal more overall effective damage, and so instead of running 4 dots, now I'm going to run 8 dots, damage actually goes up. Again, you can check the math. You can see a larger explanation on my website. I don't want to get too far out in the weeds on this, but I just want to put it out there that there is huge potential here that damage goes up next patch. This isn't necessarily a nerf to damage, even with the light attack changes, which I believe that there's already too much outcry. It gives me a sinking feeling in my stomach to think that tanks, healers, and DPS will all deal the same amount of damage with a light attack next patch. I just don't think that that's something that's going to go through. And I think about, in PvP, right? I'll go up against a super tank, someone who I cannot kill no matter what, and now you're telling me that next patch, not only will I not be able to kill that person, but they're going to deal the same damage as I am with a light attack? I don't know. I don't like that at all. Okay, so then we've touched on sustain. If you cast your dots less frequently, your sustain is improved. Now let's talk about let's go even further into the weeds on potential exploitation. So I talked about ground-based dots, and then you swap to your front bar. Maybe you equip Oaken Soul Ring, and you never recast those ground-based dots from your back bar again. Huge issue for exploitation here. Even in situations, and this isn't just PvE, right? If you're running in a ball group in PvP, and you see another large ball group running towards you, and you haven't engaged in combat with them yet, you could do some gear swapping shenanigans as well. On PC, where you have add-ons, you could gear swap to throw a whole bunch of ground-based AoEs down, and then gear swap back to your standard PvP setup. And depending on how long they make those ground-based AoEs last, you could have an area of huge damage for 20 to 30 seconds. That's dangerous. That's exploitive behavior. I mean, it's not exploiting if they put it in the game, but it's definitely a level of using the skills and the mechanics of the game in a way that may not have been intended. So another thing to keep an eye on are potential exploitable sets. So certain item sets are balanced around specific durations. The VMA bow is the first one that comes to my head. The VMA bow, the way that it works is every single time that the damage over time ticks, so every time there's another volley of arrows that fall from the sky to damage enemies, the VMA bow makes that tick deal a flat amount more damage. So currently, if you got somewhere between 10 and 13 ticks, it would amplify the damage quite a bit. Endless Hail is a very powerful ability when you're using the VMA bow. But if you increase the duration of Endless Hail to something like 24, 26 seconds, essentially doubling the duration of the dot, now that amplified damage from the VMA bow has a lot longer time to scale. If they don't change the VMA bow and they release Endless Hail with a new 20-second duration, it will potentially be the most broken item in the game for PvE, because previously the VMA bow was the most broken item in the game. They had made it so that Endless Hail would tick every half second instead of every second like it does now, and so over a 10-second duration it would tick 20 times. If they increase the current duration to 20 seconds, we're right back to that same scenario where it's going to tick 20 times, it's going to deal a ton of damage, it's going to be the best item set in the game. Other things that have the potential to pop off, the VMA dual-wield weapons. These amplify dots. If dots are getting made stronger, maybe the VMA dual-wield weapons will also get stronger with the dots. Master's daggers increase the damage done per tick of an attack. If you add ticks onto that attack, specifically rending slashes, then the Master's daggers go way up in value. Same thing, Wall of Elements. If you place down Wall of Elements and it lasts considerably longer, you will have more light attacks done on whatever target is in the Wall of Elements from the VMA or the Maelstrom Destro Staff. And so the effectiveness of that weapon also goes through the roof. Other sets to watch, and they mentioned that they were editing sets, but they mentioned that in the light attack changes, so I'm not sure if they're going to adjust sets with the ability changes in mind, but things like the Black Rose Prison Bow, that applies a dot. Alkosh, that applies a dot. Pillar of Nirn, that applies a dot. If they're making adjustments to damage over time effects, then maybe those sets will be adjusted to be stronger as well. We don't know yet. This is all conjecture. But my overall impression of the changes, I think that the light attack intent, so I think it's important to think about what their intent is. I think that the intention with the light attack changes is good. I think that lowering overall damage, especially from such a subtle attack, like I said, light attacks with a bow are practically invisible. Why should they be dealing so much damage by comparison to other skills, other abilities? I don't think removing the scaling is the right answer. I think that this takes away from players that know how to set up builds, which is a fundamental skill in this game with, the hundreds of sets that we have now. Maybe not hundreds, but we're probably approaching 200 by now. It takes away from players that have gathered that knowledge and tried to improve themselves and their builds. Taking away the scaling feels a little bit like everyone gets an A. If you set up a build that doesn't improve your offensive stats, you get an A. You get the same damage on your light attacks as someone who sets up a build. Maybe they imagine putting 10 hours into farming a build only to find out that the impact of that build is being decreased. It's lame. It's a little bit lame. But I do think that light attack damage, I think damage needs to come down, and I think that light attack damage is a reasonable location to look at. They kind of set themselves up for criticism when they introduced all these buffs to light attacks, all these different scaling to light attacks, and now they want to go back on that. But overall, the intention I can agree with. I think that rewarding players for putting the time in will still exist. Obviously, light attack weaving isn't going anywhere. It'll still exist in the game. It's still quote unquote free damage. If you're not light attack weaving, you are missing out on free damage. But yeah, we'll see what comes of this. I really don't like the idea of removing the scaling. I do like the idea of reducing the damage in some way, shape, or form. And I think most reasonable players at the higher ends would agree with that. I will say this, though. Whether or not this change actually benefits new players, I would like to see more data and more reasoning from ZOS as to why they think that's the case. Because in my experience, new players get better at the game or get elevated into endgame when established players take the time to invite them to groups before they're ready, potentially, and say, hey, just tag along and try not to die. And that gets them exposure to the content, and it gets them exposure to experienced players that are going to give them advice and help them improve. And I think when you reduce overall damage in the game, so let's use an example. Let's say I am leading a social trial in my social guild, and we decide that we're going to go do a veteran trial. Now, this veteran trial is going to require the group to be able to do, let's just say, 400k DPS, okay? Obviously, it's up for interpretation, but let's just say you need 400k DPS in order to clear the trial. If DPS is very high for the higher end players, you could bring in 2 players that deal 100k DPS, and then 5 players that only deal 40k DPS. and you'll meet the DPS threshold that you need for the group to be successful. If you lower that upper end of damage, and keep in mind, this change will also affect the lower end of damage. Nerfing light attacks does not just affect the high end. But let's speak specifically about the high end. So these 100k parsers now drop down to, let's say, 80k DPS. That is one less new player that you can now bring to that trial. Now, when that player asks, hey, can I come to the trial? You have to say, no, man, I don't think that I can bring you. We need more DPS. That does not help new players at all. That hurts new players a lot. Like, the main mechanism, in my experience, for new players to get involved in endgame has now been compromised. Yeah, just something to think about. Yeah, I would really like to see more data on why they're making this adjustment and more justification, because, you know, a lot of this wording is a little bit cryptic too. You know, they're saying the average build sees roughly 15 to 20% of their overall damage coming from light attacks alone. So they're saying the average build. But if the average player doesn't light attack weave, then this is not true, right? If the average player doesn't light attack weave, then the average build does not see 15 to 20% of their overall damage coming from light attacks. This is the average end game build. This is the average high end build. Then also down here, we've seen a reduction of 6 to 11% to overall damage. So are we going from 15 to 20% of overall damage to 6 to 11% of overall damage? Or are we reducing this 15 to 20% by only 6 to 11%? Because if it's the second scenario, why are we freaking out? And I would almost ask, why is the base level of light attacks so strong? If when you remove the scaling, you only lose 6 to 11% of the total damage on light attacks. My impression is that you're going from 15 to 20% down to 6 to 11%. But again, the wording is a little bit strange. I think when you're going to do big changes like this, it requires a lot of transparency. Otherwise, people question your intention and your motivation. I'm not saying this is the case. I don't know. But part of me thinks that maybe new players could bring more money into the game than endgame players. And so instead of saying this is motivated by money, they're trying to create a positive intent and say this makes a healthier gap between endgame players and newer players, when realistically they're just doing a change so that they can retain new players that are putting more money into the game. I don't know. But the thing is that conjecture is a result of a lack of transparency. If we understood the intention, if we had the data ourselves, and we could come to the conclusion, then questions like, well, is this only motivated by money, don't come up. Down here, combat effects. For this one, I don't know. Like, the combat effects thing, I do think that increasing the duration of dots helps newer players, because they don't have to spend as much time looking at their action bars, as much time worrying about, hey, did this dot fall off or not? And it's also less penalizing if your dots aren't up. You know, to have the same impact of not immediately recasting a 10-second dot, you would have to wait 2 seconds now to get the same impact out of a 20-second dot. Okay, you know, that making the game a little bit less punishing for new players is okay, but I don't actually think that this, in terms of making rotations easier or giving new players less to keep track of, I actually don't think that this helps. Things that would help that is, instead of making a damage over time 1.5 times the damage of a spammable, make it 1.2 times. So the best players can still use that proper rotation, use that damage over time effect, without completely eclipsing a newer player that just wants to come into the trial and use their spammable and try and watch the mechanics and learn. Increasing the damage of the damage over time only forces more damage over time abilities into a DPS's rotation. And like I said before, when you go from 4 damage over time effects to 8 damage over time effects, the complexity of the rotation in some ways gets harder. Those are my overall thoughts. Thanks for watching. I hope that you got something out of this. Again, it should be reiterated. This is not, the patch notes for a live patch. This isn't set in stone. This is merely hey, this is where our thoughts are. This is our feelings. These are some of the things that we intend to do. If you really want to see the impact that these things make, get onto the PTS, provide feedback to Zos. I remember watching a Nephis podcast here not too long ago. Talk about the problems that you're facing. Don't go to Zos and say, hey, light attack change bad, or dot change bad. That doesn't explain to them how or why it's bad. If you say, hey, I would really like to get all of the damage out of my damage over time effects, but every single time that I run with a group, the tank is moving the boss every 5 seconds, and if I have a 20-second dot, then I'm only getting, a fourth of the damage out of that damage over time effect, instead of previously what would have been half of the damage over time effect, and my damage is going down as a result of it. That's something that Zos can use and think to themselves, yeah, that's a problem. How do we change that? And while I hope that their solution isn't, we'll just make more stationary bosses, at least they have actionable feedback instead of light attack change bad. That's all I had. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.